Good evening. And on behalf of Westminster, thank you for joining us for tonight's CatTalks Beyond the Mic with Wiley Ballard and Brandon Gaudin. My name is Crawford Long, and I chair the Events Committee for the Alumni Governing Board. Our committee works in conjunction with Westminster to envision and develop programs for our alumni and for the Westminster community. Signature events that this committee has been responsible for in the past include Beyond the Gates and CatTalks. CatTalks is a TED Talk style program highlighting individual alumni experiences and expertise within the Westminster community, both in person and online. I'm honored to introduce our moderator for this evening, Daniel Searl. Born and raised in Spain, Daniel earned his journalism degree from Northwestern and relocated to Atlanta to begin his career at CNN Headline News. A career highlight, Daniel had the opportunity to serve as an interpreter during the 1996 Olympics for the Argentina men's basketball team. Dan began his journey in education as a college basketball coach at Emory, Clayton State, Towson, and eventually as athletic director and varsity girls basketball coach at Galloway. Daniel Searl joined Westminster in 2007, where he had the pleasure of having me in his first class, and has certainly left his mark. In addition to leading the award-winning student broadcast program, he teaches Spanish. He's the director of Hispanic Development, assistant basketball and soccer coach, and the Guatemala and Camino Global Program Coordinator. Please join me in welcoming Daniel to the program.
Thanks, Crawford. The formality is now over, and we will quickly shift our mood there. That first class that Crawford was in, a Spanish 5 in 2007, 2008, a memorable one. And I'm sure your Spanish is still high level, right, Crawford?
So perfectly fluent.
That same year, I got to sub for an 8th grade class. Marjorie Mitchell was teaching economics over there in Clarkson Hall. That felt like a new building at the time. I think it was the 3rd year. And sitting in there was some sparky little guy that was fired up to ask questions, get engaged, wonder what was going on. And that kid was Wiley Ballard, and he'll come back into the story here soon. So we'll welcome Wiley in, and also Brandon Gaudin. You see behind me, we've got the WCAT studio in the bottom of Ask You. Brandon's sitting here with us too, and it's going to be a great conversation tonight with Wiley. There's your screen popping up, and Brandon, who are going to tell their stories of broadcasting. Wiley through that first lens of WCAT, and then Brandon, and he's worked his way also from one of my favorite places, Butler basketball and Georgia Tech and the Braves and some Madden. I could go through the formal introductions, but the best way for this is to kind of weave your story into the conversation. Wiley and Brandon, welcome to CatTalks. It is an absolute blast to have you here. Looking forward to the stories, to the visions, and kind of catching up with you guys.
Yeah, well,
I can't wait, Dan.
I feel like the odd man out, not being a Westminster alum, although my ties to Westminster do actually run pretty deep. I learned to ride my bike in the Westminster parking lot. I think it was about 14 at the time, so I was a little late to the party. But my aunt and uncle are from down here. My cousins, Jake and Lady Espinlov, are both Westminster alum. I have played countless pickup basketball games with Searl, with Crawford here at the Turner Gym, and have played a countless number of tennis matches at the front court. So I did grow up with Westminster in my blood, even though I'm from Evansville, Indiana, and went to high school up there. This has always felt like a big part of my not only childhood, but now my professional career as well.
How about that? And yes, he just said it. We got to play pickup hoops with Jake Espinlov. Jake, who didn't make the basketball team at Westminster, but came back, plays pickup, and is a really, really high-level basketball competitor these days, as is Brandon. And when I'm pointing to the side, it's because we are sitting here.
Yeah, we're right next to each other. So.
Which is a fun thing to do and be able to interact. That's one of the keys of the broadcast journalism piece, where you get that interaction. Wiley is remote, but ready to tell some stories, right, Wiley?
I am. I think this is a good fit. I'm used to being the dugout reporter, so I'm in a different location and can offer some different insights from this perspective.
There you go. Way to weave it right in, Wiley. Well, let's hear from both of you. Let's hear a little bit about your path. And Wiley, we talked about eighth grade you putting your hand up and having all the great questions in that econ class. But I think you tell the story pretty well. As we were building WCAT, Bill McGann, who is, I believe, watching and joining us this evening, was our founder and funder of the kickoff of the digital side of WCAT back in 2010 is when we kind of officially made it happen. But how'd you get plugged into that, Wiley, and how are you sitting where you are now?
Well, first, you're nice to say I had questions in eighth grade. I'm pretty sure I was more just interrupting you constantly while you were subbing, but we had a lot of fun. Obviously, had some familiarity with you. And so the summer before my junior year, I was volunteering at a summer camp at Westminster called Inspira, and Dan was the head of that or running that. And he came up to me sometime that summer and said, "Hey, I think we're starting this, video broadcasting, streaming effort club. I'm not even sure we really had a word for it, but would you be interested?" And for me, since I was about 7 years old, a lot of my classmates would tell you that I wanted to be a sports announcer from a very young age. So I jumped at the opportunity. And I remember our first meeting was in Frank Finswaite's classroom inside Askew after school. And I was a junior. We had a lot of guys in there, Forrest Cobb, Matthew Shackelford in particular, who knew a lot more about the technology, but I was just really excited and tried to bring a positive attitude and, just tell me where I need to drag this cable and, I can do that. So that's kind of how I got involved.
You sure did, and you were all in. I remember Wiley has this agenda where the calendared out every single sports event across Metro Atlanta, pros and college. He knew who was playing where, was ready to follow those scores, knew the players. It's kind of led right into this whole announcing thing, right? And then,
Yeah, no, yeah.
What about?
I mean, I think, for me, I was just passionate about, all sports. And, once my classmates started playing at the varsity level, I think that made it that much more exciting getting to call their games.
Exactly. You had that chance to start calling games because, and this is a skill that served you well going forward, you are always ready to say, yes, I'll help, I'll be there, what can I do? And Brandon chuckles here on the side and he can add to that. But what were some of those first Westminster WCAT games that you got to call and some of those memories before we went to Brandon's story?
Well, the very first game was August 2010, my junior year. We're facing Heard County in a scrimmage. It turned out to be a driving rainstorm that night, and the game ended up getting suspended at halftime due to lightning. But we had walkie-talkies, and we tried to use umbrellas and keep the equipment dry. I was on camera for the first quarter. I was the game camera, so I was following the action from a wide perspective. And at the end of the first quarter, I found my way downstairs in the press box and asked Dan if I could, hop on the headset for the second quarter. And that's pretty much where I was the rest of my time. So I got one quarter of camera work in, and I really enjoyed it, but it was drier inside the press box.
And who'd you call that game with?
Bill McGann, and I believe Martin McGann was there, Bill's brother. And yeah, I mean, that first season was wild. I think I was actually telling the story earlier today, but, we kind of had to figure out how to look on camera. I'd been radio previously. So, we polished some things up, made sure we didn't, try and do anything, in the nasal region. We had somebody picking their nose on camera during one of the opens because we weren't used to being on camera. I won't say who it was, but it was pretty funny. And then, also, I remember vividly, one week Bill had to miss or was not available. So I stepped into the play-by-play role and Martin was the color analyst. And I remember I was, first quarter very excited, and I asked Martin a question. And after I finished asking the question, I looked over and I just see him stuffing a giant piece of pizza in his mouth. So we had to work on the rhythm and the cadence, I think, early on.
We've learned a few things, but some we haven't. Like I think we had some chatter on open mics tonight on the Zoom, which is live television. You learn to be very careful with what you're saying. Always an open mic, Brandon. You probably got some stories like that. But from early Braves and baseball watching to Indiana basketball guy. What's your quick story that got you sitting in the WCAT room in the basement to ask you?
Yeah, I think the cool connection for Wiley and I and the jobs that we get to do now with the Braves is that we both grew up diehard Braves fans. You know, the difference is Wiley is from Atlanta. I was cheering from afar, watching TBS through the 90s, the old Superstation days with Skip Carey and company. And I just grew hooked on Braves baseball because I had the opportunity in 91 when the Braves went from worst to first and in the World Series. I had the chance, I mentioned the Espinlavs, they were living in Atlanta, my cousins, my aunt and uncle. I came down to game 5 that year, and the Braves beat the Twins 14-5. I remember Mark Lemke tripling off the right center field wall to empty the bases on a bases loaded triple when the Braves opened it up. And I, from that night on, said, I'm in love with not only Braves baseball, but broadcasting through TBS and Skip Carey and the crew, as I mentioned. And so that just fostered a love for what I wanted to get into. I never imagined that 3 decades later, I would get to hold the position now that I do and share with Wiley on the Braves telecast. But that opportunity did present itself a couple years ago, and now getting ready to start my 3rd season in this role. So it's been, to say a dream come true is an understatement. There's a lot of moments that I have to pinch myself that I get to do that on a nightly basis. And gosh, Wiley and I'll be heading down for spring training here in just a couple of weeks. So it'll be go time before you know it.
What does that look like, Wiley? He's talking about the dream come true, the hometown, the Braves, which is your favorite team. And here both of you are teamed up working for the network covering the Atlanta Braves. Feelings, thoughts? How did you fall into it? How did you earn your way into it?
Well, I think there's probably a little bit of both. I think, you got to work hard and then get some luck in this industry. For me, my next step after graduating from Westminster was I chose to go to Georgia Tech. And thanks in large part, Dan, to some of the conversations and contacts you made my senior year. I remember speaking to a few of the announcers in the area at the time, Dave Cohen at Georgia State, Wes Durham at Georgia Tech, and kind of asking them, if you were in my shoes and you want to be a play-by-play announcer, what do you think about going to Georgia Tech, where there isn't a journalism school, but there's a 60 baseball games I can call, or am I better off going to, University of Maryland was my second choice, or my other school that I was really considering had a great broadcast journalism program, and they told me I would go somewhere where you can get on the air, so long as you understand that you may have to do a little more heavy lifting when it comes to networking and creating opportunities for internships, because a school like Georgia Tech's not going to have the infrastructure or the relationships with local news or local sports teams. But if you can get on the air, I think that is almost more beneficial than the degree itself. And that was kind of the advice I got, and that's what I followed. I went to Georgia Tech, started working the sports information office, which is, a fancy or maybe a less fancy name for public relations inside a college athletic department. And my freshman year, got to do a few games, and then some dominoes really started falling my way my sophomore year. Brandon was hired to replace Wes Durham at that time, and I finally got up the courage about 3 months into the semester during basketball season to go up and introduce myself. I didn't talk to him during football; I was a little intimidated. Um, and then the other piece of it was Bill McGann, who'd been doing play-by-play on WCAT for Westminster football. He wanted to go coach, and so because I was local in Atlanta down the street, Dan called me and invited me to be the play-by-play announcer for Westminster football, and I did that for about 3.5 years or so, and it so happened to coincide with the best run of Westminster football this side of like 1980, when they won the state championship in 2015. So that was a real thrill. And then after graduating, I kept doing Georgia Tech baseball, started getting a lot of freelance opportunities with ESPN Plus and different colleges. And then in 2020, I was offered a chance to join the Braves television crew in a production role, behind the scenes off camera. And, I'm sure I spoke to Brandon about it, but I spoke to a few other mentors as well and kind of asked, what do you think about this? Is this a good idea? And I think the 2 pieces of advice that I've gotten consistently over the course of my career is, you want to do 1 of 2 things. 1, you want to be working on your craft, so calling games, or 2, you want to give yourself an opportunity to make an impression upon, a potential, decision maker, I guess is the fancy term for it, but someone who could potentially help you down the line. And so for me, the opportunity to join the Braves telecast, was a great opportunity to get a chance to meet some people in some executive roles. get a chance to work on a major league broadcast, and then further down on the professional list, but probably at the top of my personal, excitement list was I got a chance to work every Braves game, which was a dream come true. So started that in 2020, and then did about that for 4 years. And then at the end of the 2023 season, there was a need for a sideline reporter in April of this past year. And I think because I demonstrated, that I was reliable, punctual, and thorough, and all of those characteristics. And I also was able to show some of the work I've done on the air for local colleges and in other roles. They kind of said, you know what, let's give it a shot. You've got the first 30 games. And I tell people, and Brandon and I talked about it, but making a jump, to Major League Baseball is going to cause a lot of nerves and anxiety. It's a big moment professionally, but for me, I felt really fortunate because I was doing it not just for a team I loved and followed closely, but mainly because I knew all of our crew. Whether it was Brandon from my time at Georgia Tech, or Gretchen Caney, our producer, who I'd worked with the last 4 years, all of our camera operators, I've had lunch with them over the years, before games. And so I think that was one area that really benefited me, is I was stepping into this, what was still is the largest spotlight I've been in so far, but I was doing it around people who I'd known for years and had really positive relationship with, and it kind of helped ease some of the nerves. So that's kind of the short version ish of how I've gotten to where I am. Yeah, I know that was.
I'll say this for Wiley, for Wiley to have the position that he does at his age, he's a decade younger than me, which I kind of have to, I don't know, it kind of brings a tear to my eye to say that. But Wiley has to be, I don't know for fact, but the youngest person in Major League Baseball television to have the role that he does on air. And when he got that opportunity last year, he got it because he earned it. He did everything the right way to get to that point. And then when he got the opportunity, he crushed it. And to the point where he was named the Georgia State Sportscaster of the Year last year, also the youngest ever to get that award. So I just, Wiley's humbled, but Wiley is, when you think about it, for now watching him over the last decade, if you want to talk about a model citizen and a model representative of Westminster for all the alums that are watching, Wiley is it. And Wiley will continue to be that as he grows his face in this market. He will be somebody certainly that makes Westminster very proud.
And it's genuine. That's the best part.
Yeah.
You're not just TV and have makeup on, but the personality and all that Brandon says.
And he does need a lot of makeup. We need to work on that. We're gonna cover that face up the best we can. I see you're working with a new haircut, by the way. It looks great, Wiley. So
I am. I had to trim it, but no, they ended up raising the budget last year or this year for my makeup expenses. So
good.
I appreciate you guys doing.
And we got you that personal assistant, right?
No, not quite.
Not just yet.
Not yet.
All right.
Okay.
But Brandon, talk to everybody a little bit about, we'll jump right to the Braves there, and then we'll come back to some WCAT questions. But how did Wiley transition into that on-air role? Many of us got to see those sideline reports.
Yeah.
But it's a new gig, and you're trying to get views and pull people in. Why did it work?
And the other people that wanted that position were very experienced, seasoned veterans in the field. That Braves sideline gig is a coveted position. The Braves, as most people in this market know, the fan base is huge, right? And it goes back to those TBS days. It has a nationwide following. There's only a handful of fan bases, I would say, that rival the Braves. The Yankees, the Dodgers, the Mets, the Cubs, the Red Sox, and the Braves are probably the ones that are at the top of that list. And that is because of the growth of the Braves through the 90s. And I say that because to get that position was not easy, and Wiley truly did earn that. And now for Wiley and I to get to go on the road and be with the team 162 games a year, the team that we grew up following, and to get to do it obviously within the realm of broadcasting that we're so passionate about. I think for each of us to be able to live out that dream and to do so together, this will be our last year. Wiley, as he said, was part-time. This year, Wiley is going to be the full-time guy. So for he and I to do that with the rest of our crew is going to be extremely special.
And give us some specifics there as you go to Philly and it's rainouts, as you go to Seattle and you're right there on Puget Sound, as you go to Chicago in the freezing cold. There's some moments there that you guys had a fun time incorporating Wiley into the broadcast.
Wiley's a team player. We threw him into the mix last year. Our first road trip was Philadelphia is where we opened. First day we got rained out. It was a monsoon and 42 degrees. We go to Chicago to play the White Sox, and we got snowed out in Chicago. And during one of those games, there was a campfire milkshake that they sold at the ballpark. And we got Wiley to eat that on air. He did so not only, I don't want to say it was graceful, it was a little salacious at times, but he sold his personality on air. And I think Braves country saw that and just kind of fell in love with Wiley's ability to make fun of himself and to be self-deprecating and also just to be talented on air. And we later had Wiley eat crickets on a West Coast trip. So Wiley did a little bit of everything this year. And again, I don't know that he did it with grace, but he crushed it however he did it. So
I did it with enthusiasm.
there
I'll
you
say
go.
that.
That's the
yeah,
word.
I think
Very
that's-
much so. How did you feel as you were now on air and you find the stories, then you deliver them with enthusiasm, and people enjoy that?
Well, I think as far as the, shenanigans or personality stuff that Brandon was talking about, I think, I think people, and anybody out there who went to school with me is in my class. I mean, it's not really a secret. I'm a goofball in a lot of ways, so I felt like that was a natural. I just try to picture being a goofball with my friends, and half the time they roll their eyes when I do stuff, but it's as far as the more baseball focused story, journalistic aspects of it. I think I got some really good advice early on from a lot of the beat writers and from Brandon. You don't want to force the relationships with players or coaches, kind of let them develop naturally. And I can't say enough. I actually remember the first game we had after the rain out, which by the way only raised the anxiety for me. That first game was finally there, and then it got pushed back another 24 hours. So, but I remember Jason Stark, who, if you're a baseball fan, you know him. He's a Hall of Fame writer, and still to this day, probably one of the most revered baseball writers in the country. And he was covering the Braves Phillies series to open the year. It's two teams that have World Series aspirations, so he was there. He went out of his way to introduce me or introduce himself to me. And he made the comment, after I told him, hey, it's my first time, I've never done this. And he looked at me and said, my gosh, you won the lottery with this clubhouse, because there's not a nicer, more welcoming clubhouse in baseball than the Braves. And I think some of that is on the credit to the organization, just the culture there, but also a lot of the individuals in that clubhouse. It's it's a very easy clubhouse to walk into. So I think that helped me a lot. And then I think the other piece that I was able to get a lot of credibility, I think, pretty fast, just based on the questions I was asking and my understanding of baseball. And it'd been a passion of mine for 15, 20 years, reading about it, studying it. And so I felt like, in covering it at the college level for a decade, I think it helped that I was able to demonstrate that I had a certain level of understanding of how the sport is played, and particularly what it's like to be in Major League Baseball in 2025 or 2024, because the technology, like almost every other industry, is just changing, it seems like, by month by month.
Yeah. No matter what industry, for people that are watching, you're in, relationships drives everything, right? And that is true in our business as well. And in particular for Wiley's job. And he talked about earning the respect of the players and Brian Snitker. And he did that almost immediately. And he did it, like he said, because he knew the game so well, and he treated everybody with respect in that clubhouse. So how it works when we go on the road, and it's similar at home, but on the road, you're more isolated and you get more time with the team. And so Wiley gets there before the rest of us that do the announcing, because he's got to do some clubhouse reporting. And so he'll get there probably 5 hours before the game, maybe 4.5 hours before, and we come on a later bus. There's 3 buses that go to the ballpark from the hotel, and we travel with the team. And so Wiley's role, though, right away being thrown in there and asking to interview all the stars that are in there, right? Strider, Acuna, Ozzie Albies, Austin Riley, and develop the rapport with those guys. And it was almost instant for him. But that clubhouse time is really where you build those relationships, and where I think Wiley was immediately able to establish credibility and get respect from the team. And look, it's also fun that we get to do that and get to develop the relationships with those guys. And when people talk about the Braves and how good the organization is, it is legit. And I'm not saying that there aren't other great organizations in professional sports and Major League Baseball. No doubt there are. But I have quickly learned in the last 2 years, and I know Wiley would echo this sentiment, the way that the Braves run that organization and the class that they have in that clubhouse, starting at the top with Alex Anthopoulos and Derek Schiller, the president, on down to Brian Snicker and the players, it is a joy and a thrill to be able to cover those guys. And so it does. Wiley kind of said it makes our job easy. It's a two-way street, right? But they really do. And that organization, for all you that are Braves fans, just know that you would feel good about the team that you're cheering for if you got to see what goes on in that clubhouse.
And the Westminster alums that are joining us this evening and get to watch this back later, one of the things that you guys have to balance out on these broadcasts is professionalism. You can't be too much of a jokester, right? But you've been able to weave in some Westminster references there, usually directed at Wiley, sometimes positive, sometimes not. What's that fine line between I'm just calling this game and I can get a personal reference in my cousin Jake and Wiley is a smart kid and so on?
It's a great question. And Wiley and I have had this discussion. I think that there is an element to all of these broadcasts, especially with baseball, because it is such a long season and we do 145 of the 162. So you multiply that by 3 hours a night. Do people want to hear baseball first and foremost and know about the game? Absolutely. And that will always be paramount. But is there time to have fun and to be lighthearted and to insert jokes? I think it would be silly not to do that because our job is fun. And when you get home, if you have a normal 8 to 5 and you get home and you got kids screaming and you're cooking dinner, you get them down and you just want to sit down with a beer and watch the game. That is when I think you want to be entertained. And the first form of entertainment is just watching the Braves, right? So we need to keep that in perspective. But keeping it lighthearted and letting you know at home that we're having fun, and hopefully that comes through the television sets, I think that is very important. And that's one thing that I think Wiley does so well and fit in seamlessly is the right amount of baseball to fun ratio, right? We can't always have Wiley eating crickets and milkshakes on air, as fun as that would be. Wiley's baseball first. But we know that when we can poke fun, have a joke, I can call him the pride of Westminster and say that he's on dating apps, even though he's not. Those are moments of levity that I think make it more personal, and also in the midst of a long season, allow you to have fun and let the viewer know that, hey, this is baseball, but we're also going to have a good time along the way.
How about that?
I think all I would add is that
definitely is the pride of Westminster. That's what I was going to say, Wiley. But you're not the only.
All I can say is, of all the digs Brandon took at me, the one that stung the most actually came from Jeff Francoeur when he questioned my athleticism when I was, and my lack of competitive sport experience so much that Chad Laney, our head baseball coach here at Westminster, mailed me a varsity letter. So I could show Jeff Francoeur that I had earned a letter. So I did not earn a letter in high school, so I haven't gotten the jacket yet, but I want to give a big shout out to Chad Laney for taking sympathy on me and helping me stand up to the bully that is Jeff Francoeur.
And our guy Bobby Bryant's working hard to get some letters for WCAT going forward. We'll see, and we'll send you one, Wiley.
All right.
Brandon, you mentioned 145 games a season and plus some playoffs, or depending on how that shakes out. Got a question from Keely Hartman, who is also the pride of Westminster. She'll be on campus tomorrow for the Women in Sports panel. So looking forward to having Keely there for that. But she asked, how do you prep for all of those games, deliver those 3-hour broadcasts, and don't get burned out?
Yeah, well, I have a process, and I know that Wiley does too, of what I like to do every day. It'd be very easy to assassinate me. I hope nobody wants to do that, but because I pretty much have the same routine every single day. I know when I'm going to wake up. I know when I'm going to work out. I know when I'm going to eat lunch. And I have a routine that takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours every morning when we're on the road or when we're at home. That is basically a cleanup of all of my stats and notes for the broadcast that night. Now, for the Braves, it's a quick process because why? Well, we're seeing that team every night. We have access to the team now, but I always want to know, okay, if I'm a viewer, what can I learn tonight that's new about Acuna or Albies or Riley that these guys haven't already told me? So that becomes the challenge, is how can you weave in new, interesting nuggets about Braves players to keep it fresh? But also, I do want to keep in mind that as a viewer, you're also interested in the other team. Now, you're more interested in the Braves, but you want to know what's going on with these other teams. And so that's where more of the prep comes in for me, is making sure that I'm well-versed on the opponent. And that's what I spend a majority of the time doing in the morning and the early afternoon before going to the ballpark, is updating my Braves notes first. I always go through the Braves first, read all the articles from last night, and then do the same for the opposing team. And as far as keeping it fresh, and you said not getting worn out, look, it is a long season, but I always try to remind myself that it is a privilege to do this job. And that's not just a word speak. I mean that. It is a privilege to do this job. And so does the season get long? Does it get monotonous? Well, sure. Just like anybody doing this, that would be the case no matter what background you come from. But at the end of the day, you're getting to sit up in a press box and broadcast a baseball game. And I think keeping that front of mind in those times where you feel worn down can kind of give you that better perspective of, hey, this is okay. We can push through this. So
that's awesome, Brandon. And Wiley, a similar question from Keely for you. And I look in the other room here in the WCAT studio, and your boxes of the boards you did for Westminster football back in the day are still in there, and your binders. How do you get through this prep and bounce between this sport, that sport, college, high school, pro, sidelines, play-by-play, analyst? That's a lot. How do you manage it?
So I think I'll be honest, I had done some sideline reporting for football, prior to last spring before I stepped into the Braves role. But I'd say 90 to 95% of the work I had done as a broadcaster had been in that play-by-play role. Again, Westminster football, a lot of Georgia Tech sports, some Auburn sports. And so there was a little bit of a learning curve for me, and I picked the brain of some other sideline reporters who've been doing it for a while. And for me, Brandon touched a lot on wanting to be familiar with the opponent. I probably don't do as much of that because most of my material is going to be Braves centric, not 100% of the time. So for me, what I will do, I try and ask myself, okay, what can Brandon and CJ not, have a more difficult time getting? I can read the same articles they're reading, when it comes to coverage of the Braves and the Mets. But because I have that time in the clubhouse, and because I don't have to film the open necessarily, and I don't have some other obligations that they do prior to the game, I have a lot of time to be around the cage, be around the dugout, inside the clubhouse. And so I really try to prioritize conversations with players, coaches. And then when it comes to delivering, the one that comes to mind is, I had a conversation with Jared Kelnick probably, I don't know, a week or two into the season. We were discussing, his amateur baseball journey, what it was like traveling from, Wisconsin to go play in these tournaments in Florida and California, and had a long discussion. But one of the things he touched on was that he loved to pitch. Obviously, he's not a pitcher at the major league level, but growing up as an amateur, he pitched all the time, and he talked about his repertoire, how he liked to pitch, and all those things. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, next time Jared Kelnick throws somebody out at the plate, I'm going to tell that story because he shows what a big arm he has. And so for me, I would try and enter a game with, once we get into the full season, maybe even 10 to 12 potential stories that I could tell. And then based on what happens on the field, I can pick 2 or 3 of those to give on a given night. And so that's kind of how my prep goes. I'm constantly trying to have conversations and follow-up questions and checking back in on, Austin Riley said, I've been really focusing on this with my swing. He said that back in early April. I'll circle back to it at the end of the month and say, hey, what kind of became of that adjustment you were trying to make? Was it successful? Did you stick with it? Did you go back to what you were doing initially? And so I think for me, I'm just constantly trying to make sure I'm developing those conversations I'm having within the locker room when it comes to personnel and staff and players and so forth.
Yeah, and Wiley and I will talk because I don't want to step on Wiley's toes if he's got a great story that maybe I overheard in the clubhouse. I want to let him tell that because it also, when Wiley's done, he does a very good job of leading the discussion back to CJ or Jeff and I in the booth, and we can follow up and continue that conversation. Because over the course of a 9-inning game, being able to have fodder like that to carry through a half inning or a full inning while also paying attention to what's going on, obviously, I think that's a recipe a good broadcast. I think Wiley brought so many good things. He mentioned the Kelnick story. He had a great one on Reynaldo Lopez and why he wore a mouthpiece to not tip pitches. Just valuable things that you can incorporate into a broadcast, that access that a fan cannot get by getting on their computer and looking up somebody's batting average and slugging percentage. And that, I think that's where the magic elixir lies, and Wiley does a tremendous job at that.
Magic elixir. How about that? So
Say quickly, Dan, the only thing I would
go ahead, Wiley. Yeah.
You're good. Sorry. You know, the highlight for me of that first month, or one of the highlights, to Brandon's point, when it comes to discussion, is I think it may have had to do something with Ronaldo, but it wasn't about the mouth guard. I think it was his velocity. But one of the highlights of the year for me was, you know, I asked a question back to the booth when Brandon was working with Tom Glavin, and Glav basically took it and talked for a solid 5 minutes about the topic that, or the question I asked. And you know, if you're watching a game and you want to know when I think I'm doing a good job, if I get Tom Glavin talking about pitching for 5 minutes, I'm like doing a touchdown dance in the dugout. Everybody's looking at me saying, "What's going on?" So that's kind of, you know, my scoreboard, if you will. I really try to make sure that whatever I'm bringing, you know, whether it's out of a commercial break or even during an inning, generates, you know, a further discussion between Brandon and CJ, or Brandon and Tom, or Brandon and Frenchie.
Nice. Hey, everybody who's watching here and listening to these stories, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Make sure you drop them in the Q&A below there, and we'll check them out and share them here with Wiley and with Brandon. And one of them is, and Keely had asked kind of your back and forth between sports, Wiley, but during the Brave season, you both are locked in. There is time for nothing, but what does the off season look like? Are you covering other sports? Are you taking a break? What is that going to be like for both of you?
Yeah, we both cover other sports. I won't step on Wiley's toes. I'm in the middle of basketball season. When I started doing the Braves a couple of years ago, I cut down the number of basketball events that I do just to have a little bit more breathing room. I used to do usually 3 basketball games a week. Now I'm down to 1 or 2. My next one is Saturday at Michigan State. And they have been great with me about working with my schedule, pairing it with the Braves. When I go down to spring training next month, thankfully, Fox was great with me about saying, okay, you can take off this game. We'd like to have you here if you don't mind missing that Braves spring training game. So I'm in the middle of basketball season, but it certainly is a little slower than baseball. And then once the season starts on the 27th of March, I'll be baseball in earnest up until October. And I used to do football, but I made the decision last year to stop doing football, just to have October as kind of my sanctuary month, my sabbatical month, if you will, and took time to see family and friends, and really enjoyed October and the Atlanta weather here, which I think October is the best. Atlanta's got a lot of good months. October's right there at the top of the list for me. So yeah, October's kind of my respite, and then right into basketball starting November 1st.
And you are a basketball guy initially, right? From radio at Butler when they made their runs to the Final Four and to the championship games, right?
Yeah, I graduated from Butler. I mentioned I'm from Indiana, and I was just lucky, just right place, right time to be there when they made that second run to the Final Four in 2011. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that well. They lost to UConn that year. And then after that is when I moved down to Georgia Tech. That's what got me to Atlanta originally in 2013. And that's when I met Wiley while he was a student there. So it's hard to believe I've been in Atlanta a decade now, but what I always wanted to put roots here. But for the first 8 years of my existence in Atlanta, I was gone all the time. I was gone 250 nights a year calling baseball, football, and basketball. And I was on every flight out of Hartsfield Jackson, it felt like. So I never really had a base. But now this Braves job has allowed me to really put down roots here and have a base here. And that's another thing I'm thankful for, because I have just grown to love this city so much over the last decade.
And Wiley, how about you? Do you get an off season and escape, or are you looking for a Skyhawks game today and a Georgia Tech women's hoops game tomorrow?
Well, I'd say the reason I'm not with you guys currently is because I'm in my sabbatical. January and early February tends to be sort of my time to take a breather. As soon as baseball season ends, I still cover a good amount of high school football, you know, a good amount of college basketball, college volleyball. I'll have a good number of college baseball and softball games in February and March before Brave season begins. I'll be down for training for about a week, but I'll be doing a lot of play-by-play opportunities. And for me, you know, it's really important, you know, taking this Braves job is a dream come true. It's a thrill. It's a terrific professional opportunity. But it does take me away from play-by-play, which is where I'd like to be ultimately. So I really prioritize those opportunities come October, November, December. And like you touched on, it's a lot of college sports. And, if you're watching a game on ESPN.com, maybe it's not on linear television. I'll do a lot of those games. I'll do a lot of Georgia Tech men's basketball. I did an Auburn men's basketball game this past November. They've turned out to be pretty good. A lot of volleyball, a lot of softball, all of those things. So that's kind of where, how it works out for me. And I think, same with Brandon. I don't think there's really a shortcut to getting, up to speed on a team. You've got to read a lot. You've got to stay up to date. And I think, like we've touched on, just having conversations and those relationships, I'm sure Brandon's got plenty in the Big Ten that, in the era of, calling Braves baseball, he's probably able to rely on those relationships he's had. If he does have a question, if he feels like he's pulled in two different directions, he can get that answer because he's been working that league for so long.
Right. Okay. Well, Steve Cohen, thanks for those questions, especially on the off season. They both got to expand on that. Let's take it back to WCAT days, Wiley. Question from that guy you got to call some games with, Bill McGann. And this is both as you built up your skills and your reps. Bill is both kidding and serious with his question about when your play-by-play person came to the games completely unprepared. Is that when you realized that you had to do all the prep work, and that's where you gained that skill that has served you so well the rest of your career?
Between that and trying to pass, your junior classes at Westminster, you learn how to prep and study really well. But yes, Bill, I've never worked with somebody like Bill in my career. He is larger than life. I hope he's cackling behind his computer screen right now. And I think to be honest with you, I learned a lot from Bill. I learned, he would say I learned what not to do, and maybe there was some of that, but I also learned a lot about how to have fun, how to engage with people. And, I think as a typical Westminster student, when I first started doing those games, I was so I don't want to say stressed, but so focused on trying to be so thoroughly prepared. I wanted to have every detail, every T crossed, every I dotted, which you still want to do as a broadcaster. But just because you do that, it doesn't mean you have to blurt all of those details out on the air. I think you can still prioritize, camaraderie in the booth, having a sense of humor. And I think I learned a lot of that from Bill. And, Brandon and Dan, you guys have gushed on me enough. I think Bill McGann and what he did for WCAT. You mentioned the funding, the founder, but beyond just the financial contribution to get us some top level equipment, I think he, along with you, Dan, set the tone for what WCAT still is today, which is a fun, exciting club, group. I think if you play varsity sports at Westminster, there's a lot of high expectations, a lot of intensity. I think WCAT has done a nice job of almost sort of offering a different environment where it's come and go as you please. But when you're here, you are empowered. You have a chance to produce your own video, your own piece, call your game. And I think that really started with both you, Dan, and Bill McGann. Just the attitude and the fun-loving vibe you guys sort of instilled in the culture there in those first couple of years.
Hopefully we can keep that going. And sitting in the room here behind us is Palmer Ruth, the current senior, who's run with that just like you did years back, and from social media to announcing games to getting the hype video for the winter sports pep rally tomorrow ready. Students are the ones that really make this go, and Bill and Martin McGann and the families have the press box now behind them and the name on there. And if anybody's around, make sure you stop by and check out the press box in the football stadium. The technology that the students have at their fingertips is next level, and it's fun to watch as everybody learns and figures it out.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add, as someone from the outside that came in and got to see what WCAT is like, this is not everywhere. And it is a privilege for these kids to have these opportunities. But it is also something that when you are at the front edge as a high school of something that is being done, like is being done here at Westminster, it is invaluable. And when I have talked to the students here, Searl has set me up with a few of the students over the last few years, hearing them talk about this place with such pride and this program with such pride and the opportunities that have springboarded them to starting in a career, and whether it's communications or broadcasting at the college level, that all started here at WCAT, and the value of it cannot be understated, because I've seen it at places where it's nothing like this, and I've seen it at places where it's trying to be this, but it's not at this level. And what you guys have here at Westminster with WCAT, the value to the students is really second to none. And like I said, I'm not just saying this because I'm here with this group. I don't think it can be understated.
All right. Thank you for saying that. And again, the students are working really hard to make this happen, and there's support from faculty, from the school, and from alums, which brings it all together. Brandon, got a question here from David Zevon about Skip Carey and your times interacting and using some of those expressions. Tell us a little bit about the Braves win. I'm not even going to try.
Yeah.
And do you get to kind of recognize
Sure.
Skip that way?
Yeah, it was always Skip's thing at the end of every Braves win to say Braves win. That was what he said at the final out. And watching the games as a kid, there were so many of Skipisms, as I like to call them, that kind of stuck with me. And I will just find that they come out from time to time. That one is a little more top of mind. I don't say it every broadcast. It's not necessarily because it was his thing. I think that people enjoy paying tribute to him that way, but I do try to do it for most games, especially the home games. If it's an exciting win, the throw over to first, the smack of the glove, and you say Braves win, just to kind of put an exclamation mark on it. That certainly is a tribute to Skip Carey, the guy who is the reason that I got into this business. And it's not lost on me that his son Chip was here for years before I got the job. And I loved listening to Chip. And Chip has been a tremendous friend and mentor to me. Now he's with the St. Louis Cardinals now. So that Carey family, that lineage, it was an honor to replace him. It was also a very daunting thing for me to know that a Carey had been in the booth the last 40 years, but to have that opportunity was incredibly cool. But there are other sayings that he would always say on a fly ball that was hit high in the air, he would call it a high, lazy fly. And I find myself doing that on high, lazy fly balls to the outfield. There's just certain things listening to him night after night in my childhood that will come through naturally on the broadcast. And some people may know it watching, some people may not, but it kind of always gives me a smile. It's kind of like Skip's there with me.
There's another expression. We got a question from Janet Roach here. You're so long, everybody.
Yep.
That you use. Is there a story behind that sign off?
That's Skip. Skip would say that a lot when they would go off the air on the old TBS days. So long, everybody. And that stuck with me. And every time I would broadcast make-believe games in my living room in Evansville, Indiana. I took a wadded up balloon. I put a piece of tape around it. That was my ball. And the inside of a paper towel roll, that cardboard insert, was my bat. And I would throw that balloon up and hit it. I would run the bases, which were pillows. My mother hated it. And I would announce the games as if I was Skip Carey. And at the end of every game, I would act like I was wrapping up the broadcast. And I would say, so long, everybody, saying it to nobody but myself and my family living room. But yeah, so to be able to do that, like I said, 3 decades later is really, really special.
I love it. That's fantastic. And Wiley, we've got some questions here from Rivers. What are your go-to calls? And what are some of your most memorable Westminster calls, specifically as you did football and other sports? I'll toss out the hype video that you did right before the semifinals or finals of the 2015 football, where you did a voiceover all the way through the path of the Cats across the state, up and down and back and forth. It's just seared in my brain, and I love that one. But what are your memories, the ones that count here?
Well, I mean, I think, Rivers asked the question. I got to, throw in Rivers scoring a touchdown our senior year. Is that an easy call? No, I think, honestly, those runs through the state playoffs, just because throughout most of my time as a student at Westminster, we'd have a solid team and usually win the first playoff game, lose in the second round to a team that wound up going all the way to the Georgia Dome or wherever they played it that year. And when that 2014 and 2015 teams, when they broke through getting to the quarterfinals and the semifinals, I remember those very vividly. Beating Hart County 10 years ago when, your first and second string quarterbacks were both out. So you had to run the Wildcat the whole game to try and get to the semifinals for the first time since I believe it was 1996 off the top of my head. But yeah, Zay Malcolm, special player, Rankin Woolley. There were some moments there, but I'd say that win over Hart County to get to the semifinals, and the following year, the win over Cedar Grove, which really wasn't a dramatic game. Westminster kind of just took charge and took the air out of the ball. But to get to the state championship, again, the first year I started doing Westminster football, they went 6-7 or 5-6, whatever it was, and I was just excited to get the reps. I just wanted to get on the air, and then lo and behold, that class with again so many names making those deep runs in the playoffs, that was pretty unbelievable. And some people have asked me, did you call the state championship? And I did not. And I'm actually really glad I didn't, because I felt like that was a moment I was able to be unprofessional and be on the sideline and watch the chaos unfold. And anybody who watched that game 10 years ago, it was overtime, an unbelievable comeback. And yeah, so I'd say those are some of my Westminster football, some of my favorite memories would be those two.
How about that? All right. You talk about some of your calls, Brandon, as we start to wrap things up here, because we could talk for hours and hours. Any favorite call or memorable call that sticks in your brain of a Butler basketball, of Georgia Tech?
Well, I don't know that it was the call specifically, but for me, it's Wiley talking about calling games at his alma mater. When I got to call games at Butler and was on the call for the Elite Eight game where they won in overtime over Florida in 2011 to go back to the Final Four, that's a moment of euphoria that will always stick with me because I was so invested in the team. I was an employee of the university. I was an alum. You wanted their success so bad. It was such a feel-good underdog story. And I just will always remember when that final buzzer sounded in New Orleans and Butler was going back. I don't even remember. I kind of remember what I said. I said something about some stupid cliche because the Final Four was in Houston about Houston meet Butler. And I don't know. It was dumb. It was probably a terrible call, but the moment itself, I remember that so vividly. I talked about being at Game 5 in the '91 World Series. That's what sports does. It captivates us, man. It just does. And there are probably 10, there's a lot of memories, but there's probably 10 or so memories that are just so in my brain, how it smelled, how it felt, how it looked. And though that World Series with the Braves is certainly at the top. And then that one with Butler in 2011. And I was on my couch for still to this day what I call the greatest sports moment in history, when Sid Bream slid into home in '92 to beat the Pirates in Game 7 of the NLCS, and Skip Carey, I have a recording of his call, and that's one of my cherished memories.
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, for both of you there, as you talk about the Braves, once again, give us some insight. We're homers. We love our team, but what does it look like for this season? What do you think?
I'll let Wiley go first. Let's go down to Wiley Ballard.
Thanks for passing the buck, Brandon. I think offensively, they're still going to be among the best in baseball. I think you had a lot of guys who either got hurt or in the case of Matt Olson, just weren't themselves. So I still think they have one of the top 2, 3, 4 offenses in baseball. I think the top of the rotation is very strong. Chris Sale, Spencer Strider. I heard Alex Anthopoulos on the radio last week say he's progressing faster than they anticipated. Ronaldo Lopez put together a really strong year in the rotation. Spencer Schwellenbach came up and looked like a veteran. So I think those two pieces are very strong. If I had a concern, and for me right now, it's probably the bullpen, just because you've lost so many critical pieces to that group. AJ Minter, who'd been a staple in the Braves bullpen, the back end, and now with the Mets. Joe Jimenez is going to be out until hopefully September. He could be out for the entire year. And to me, behind Raisel Iglesias, those were two of your most trusted arms from last season. So I will say the bullpen's my largest concern right now, but I think it's also important to remember that that's a group that can be added and adjusted and changed all the way up until July 31st. And I still think they're the most volatile. It's the most volatile part of the sport right now, is trying to anticipate who's going to have a good bullpen. I think you got some guys behind them. Dylan Lee, for instance. I think Daysbel Hernandez has a chance to be a really special arm. I'd throw in Pierce Johnson as well. And again, it's just hard to predict. A reliever can be an all-star one year and then, get released the next. It's just very volatile back there. But on paper, the bullpen's my biggest concern.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Wiley, and also the health of Acuna and Strider. So both are on pace right now to come back in the first half, earlier rather than later. There's not a specific date. There are dates that have floated out there on the internet, but I don't think they're extremely accurate, but they're in the ballpark. If they come back and they're healthy and they are themselves, it changes the whole season, right? I mean, you're talking about one of the best players, MVP in baseball a couple of years ago in Acuna, and certainly one of the most dominant pitchers in recent memory in baseball in Spencer Strider. So bullpen will be something to watch, but if you can get Strider back in the rotation, you can get Acuna back in right field. For those that didn't see, the Braves signed a guy who had an incredible year last year to play left field in Jerks and Profar from San Diego. So I think they feel like they've got the pieces. And look, Alex Anthopoulos is a magician. I'm sure at the trade deadline, whatever needs are there, if it is the bullpen, he will find a way to plug those gaps. And I think we're talking about a Braves team again that makes the playoffs and hopefully has more success than last year when they had all those injuries.
I'm over here grinning, just listening. This is what they do, right? They've got the baseball knowledge, they chat with each other, and they share it with all of you watching. Let's help take away some frustration for our crew here on Zoom. Where do we watch the Braves this year, and what's it called, right? I know that's a touchy question, but that's what people care about. I want to watch Wiley and Brandon. I saw him on a Zoom. How do I do this?
Yeah, there's a couple answers to that. The short of it is that Bally Sports is now FanDuel Sports. It's the same, it's just a different color scheme, a different mic flag that we hold on the broadcast. But there will be more access this year. I don't have specific details, but streaming will be easier. I'm not going to say it's going to be everywhere, but it's going to be more places than it was previously. So there should be a few, hopefully less complaints about that. Back on Comcast, so that shouldn't be an issue. I know that was a big thing for a lot of Braves fans last year, myself included. I had Comcast and I couldn't get the broadcast. And also this year, 15 games are going to be simulcast on Gray Media. A lot of people may not know what that is, but it's a group of stations essentially that covers all of Braves country in the Southeast. And a lot of those are the Friday night games. So that'll give access to a lot of people, at least for some of the games that had not had it previously. But look, there are building blocks in the right direction. Wiley and I hear the same things repeated and have the same frustrations as the rest of you. Why does Major League Baseball make it so hard for their fans to access a product? We get it. And the short story is there's a lot of litigation and contracts involved in that, but I think it's getting better.
All right, that's good to hear. And one thing to plug, and again, the student Palmer Ruth, who does our social media here, the Brave social media is really good. You get all the video clips and the content there to follow along right there on your phone too. Listen, everybody who has been asking questions in the chat in the Q&A section, thank you for interacting here with us. And I think we're coming to the conclusion of the program, and we'll let Crawford wrap things up for us as his box comes back in the Zoom, and we get to kind of close it out, Crawford.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you to Brandon and Wiley for sharing your time and stories tonight. I mean, I'm pretty excited for spring training here the next couple of weeks. I could listen to you guys talk Braves baseball, all night, but I do thank you for sharing the time tonight. I also want to shout out Wiley. He also serves on our Young Alumni Council, so he spent a lot of time in the school and the great work that they're doing. And thank you to everyone who joined us online. You are going to get a brief survey. I know, but please, take a little bit of time, give us some feedback. It helps us with events like this. You also get a recording of tonight's event, and you can find that on the WCAT YouTube channel. As you can see on the screen here, we have a very busy spring. Wiley and the Young Alumni Council are hosting a networking night next week. We have the Women's Symposium in March, reunion weekend in April on the 25th and 26th, and then events in DC and San Francisco. Lastly, please, I'd encourage you to consider supporting current Westminster students, whether you're volunteering to mentor some students or supporting programs like WCAT through giving of the annual fund. Your support makes a huge difference. Again, huge thank you to Wiley, Brandon, and Dan. I hope to see you at a Westminster event sometime soon.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Crawford. Yep. Thanks, everyone.